Yeah. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. This is a presentation of the first really comprehensive EEO data analysis that we did in our district. We actually did this analysis last year as part of our new 3-year EEO plan. I did some presentations in the fall. There was some mixed attendance at those. And what I ultimately want to do with this, as I sent out in the email, is convene a district-wide work group to look comprehensively at how we do recruitment, application, interviewing, screening, hiring, holistically. And so I thought it would be a good idea based on a lot of feedback I received that we do this again. We invite people to participate on Zoom. We record it and post it so that those that can't participate live can view it, because we're going to send out that call to participate in that work group and want everybody to be able to be fully informed. So I get to do a little bit of high flex instruction today and pretend I'm one of our amazing faculty members. With that, let's bring up the slides. I want to dive right in because I have a lot to cover. Actually, a couple of housekeeping things before I get to the presentation. I would like to have questions as we go if you have them. So here in the room, we have some microphones. If you'll raise your hand or give a cue, you got a question, we'll get a microphone. Please wait for that so that folks on Zoom can hear you. If you're on Zoom and you'll use the raise hand feature, Amanda Ficken-Davis will be monitoring for questions, and then she'll interrupt me as I'm going, and then she'll unmute you and let you know you can go ahead and ask. But I would rather we do it in real time because it's pertinent to whatever data we're talking about that's on the slide in that moment. If we come back to it at the end, I might have forgotten the context and not be able to answer it as well. You may have forgotten your question. So with that bit of housekeeping, let's dive right in. So first, let me set the case for why it matters to do this. EEO data analyses identify patterns in the way that we go about employing people. Who do we employ when we layer in race and gender? Well, how does that compare to our external availability? And I'll talk about what exactly that term means in the context of the analyses. And then what happens in the actual hiring process when we look to who applies, who meets qualifications and moves throughout that process, and then who ultimately do we hire? And do we see patterns? It's a really interesting moment around this kind of work. So I did work like this for a better part of 12 years while I worked in the federal government. There was an executive order that was issued last week that would basically eliminate this type of analyses under the heading of ending disparate impact theories of discrimination. What we're doing here is not about finding discrimination. It's identifying patterns and allocating resources, as I'll talk about. So nothing's changed in an employer's ability to do this. Nothing's changed in a statewide requirement we have to do this. But the way that at the federal level, they're going to pursue identifying disparities in employment, the kind of analysis you're going to see is not going to be done by agencies like the one that I used to work for that's right on the verge of not existing anymore. So it's a really fascinating time for me personally to experience what's happening in the federal sector at the same time as we're making major advancements in what we're doing locally to be able to see patterns in the data and align decision-making with the data. So why does this matter? Because, of course, click on the presentation.
Yeah, try it.
There we go. Because in order to meet our mission, we have to ensure that everybody working here is aligned with the idea that whatever role you have, you are part of an educational mission to uplift the diverse individuals and communities we serve through culturally responsive teaching, learning, and work environments. And we added "and work environments" to stress both the experience that we have as employees in this environment and in the way we serve each other. So this isn't just in the classroom or in counseling offices or in the libraries. This is how we interact with each other as payroll and the business office are moving work between each other, because we have a highly diverse group of employees working here. We need a culture where every interaction is reinforcing in a positive way the experience of our diversity, where we're pursuing equity and outcomes in every way that we could possibly define that as a central part of how we do our job. So yes, this matters in facilities, because if two custodians are telling sexist jokes and somebody walks by and hears that and goes, oh, this is the kind of place where you get to talk that way, where you can think that way and act that way. And it undermines this mission statement right at its core. So it matters everywhere. If we're successful in pursuing our mission, we could achieve a vision where everybody who comes in to participate as employees, as students, in whatever capacity within our district experiences this idea of inclusive excellence. spaces where they feel immediate belonging, where they can achieve the outcomes of whatever it is that brought them here. And we can truly live up to this tagline of you can be who you are. You don't have to transform yourself to be someone we want to serve. In being who you are, you'll experience belonging, and ultimately that will facilitate you becoming whatever it is that brought you to our district. EEO data analyses do 5 different things. One, we develop a quantitative, a numerical measure for what workforce diversity looks like. And I'll talk a little bit about the history of that in our system. And then when I joined the system, how I was able to influence this conversation and what you're going to see in the way that we did our analysis. We take that quantitative measure of workforce diversity and compare our current workforce demographics. What do we look like right now in terms of race, ethnicity, currently gender, but as I'll talk about, that is going to evolve to include sexual orientation and gender identity. Comparing those 2 numbers, there's a benchmark for where we say we have fewer people that identify as a particular race or ethnicity or gender identity than we would expect compared to that diversity metric. And that's where we should put our time and resources into improving workforce diversity. We then look at the hiring process. So we look at from start to finish, who applies, who gets hired, and then we break it down into each step. Who applies, who meets minimum qualifications. Who meets minimum qualifications and gets reviewed by a committee. Who does a committee say we should interview? Who does the committee say should go to a second interview? Who do we ultimately hire? As we layer in race, ethnicity, and gender identity throughout that process, do we see barriers at some point? Do we see disparities? And so all of that data informs us understanding where do we stand currently with workforce diversity and how should we be thinking about evolving. Historically, this has been defined as race, ethnicity, and by sex characteristics. And so ethnicity under federal law and in the state is Hispanic, non-Hispanic. It's one question. Do you identify as Hispanic or non-Hispanic? After you answer that question, it determines what's going to happen as far as race after that. If you check I am Hispanic or Latino, then that's how you get categorized in our data, in federal data, as being Hispanic. Whatever you check after that, you're going to be identified as Hispanic or Latino. Race is every other category that's identified. Black, Indigenous, Native American, Asian, Pacific Islander, white. We offer a much wider range of choices for people to identify race, ethnicity, national origin than you would see it in a federal intake form. But ultimately, we collapse those down to categories. And as I'll talk about a little later, that's necessary in order to have numbers large enough to identify patterns. Although there's a horrible history behind those categories, isn't the focus of today's presentation, but it does have value in allowing us to identify those patterns. There have been limited analytical requirements based on ability status and on veteran status. And so we ask for that information of applicants. We can do an analysis on it, but typically what I find is that so few people, especially with ability status, will actually identify at all. It's difficult to find any meaningful outcome from it. And it makes sense why you wouldn't identify, because if you don't feel like you need some form of reasonable accommodation, saying I identify as an individual with a disability, I might assume you're only asking that because you won't hire me if I check yes. So I'm not going to tell you anything, or I'm going to say no whether I actually do or not. So we have work to do on communicating the importance of having that information to use in a positive way for workplace accessibility and to improve our accommodations process. But what I found when I went into our data, like more than 90% of people didn't answer it at all. And so there isn't much analytic value. And as I mentioned, we have recently expanded employee self-identification options and applicant options to include sexual orientation and gender identity. So in future years, we'll be able to update this to include more than just male and female in that part of the analysis. But right now, this data was looking back 2019 to 2023. We didn't have those options. So the workforce utilization analysis, as I said, a quantitative definition of diversity. The history of this and the way that I was doing it when I worked in the federal government, it was the idea of creating an external availability. If I know where you're recruiting and I know something about the demographics of the people in that area, does your applicant pool, does your workforce look like the pool you're recruiting from? And so the census, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they collect data and publish data that can tell you something like, of all of the people living in San Diego County, this number work as post-secondary teachers. And of the people that we know that work as post-secondary teachers, this percentage identify as Black, as white, as Asian, Pacific Islander, Native American. So I can do an analysis that way, where I'm trying to get a really defined sense of who could we hire that has the skills to do our jobs? And do we look like that pool of people? For our colleges much more broadly outside of the classroom, that gets very difficult to create a statistic for, because the standard definition of occupational titles that the Department of Labor produces does not match a lot of the jobs that we have. So it'd be very difficult to say, this is the pool of people that likely meet our minimum qualifications for each of our jobs. And this became a sticking point for the system. So it was about 22 years ago that the updates to Title V happened that required districts to do this kind of analysis. And the line that used to be in Title V is when the Chancellor's office provides this portion of the data, the external availability. They hired UCLA. Now here's my joke. They'd have hired somebody from USC. They would have gotten it done. Kidding. UCLA correctly told them the data that you need to create that doesn't exist, because that's the question that was being asked. Who are the qualified people we could be recruiting? You can do that for a few of your jobs. You cannot do it broadly. And so the requirement never happened because the Chancellor's office could never publish that data. So when I got involved in the EEO and Diversity Advisory Committee in 2017, I said, what if we changed our thinking around that away from here are the people that meet the qualifications, and took multiple data sources and said, here's what we mean by diversity within our communities that we serve. Part of that is our student communities, who's showing up right now, who lives in our area, where are we recruiting from, and then using IPEDS data from the Department of Education, who are the people that have a master's degree broadly across the country? So we think about our traditional academic faculty positions and our educational administrators that require that master's degree. We know the universe of people that have that degree with race and gender data going back several years. So you can create something of a proxy for a qualified applicant pool. But if we blend those together and say, this is not a representation of what our applicant pool could look like, it is the idea of what workforce diversity means for us, and then measure ourselves to it. Worked with a couple of the law firms that the system been working with. They liked the idea, because again, we're not saying this is going to be evidence of discrimination in a legal case. We don't need to meet that level of definition. It's a good way, though, to define a number, something you can compare yourselves with and say, we should spend our time and resources focused here. So that's what I'm going to share with you, how we did that. The 5 data sources we looked at are our current students district-wide across all 4 colleges. The population estimates for San Diego County, not just people that are working in San Diego County, but everybody who lives here. What are the demographics by race, ethnicity, and gender? Because we do recruit statewide quite a bit. Me being one of those people who did not live in San Diego County, saw a job and said, hey, I'd like to apply and come down. And we do that nationwide. Is Jared in here? I always like to point to him. There he is. He moved from across the country to come live here, right? So it's not a huge portion of our applicant pool, but we do, especially in faculty and administrator positions, draw nationwide. And then I mentioned that 5th data point. I went into the IPEDS data system and figured out where I could pull a report of all the Title IV institutions. So every institution that participates in federal financial aid has to provide this data. It's like 6,500 colleges and universities across the country every year saying, here's the number of degrees we awarded in math at a baccalaureate level, at an associate's level, master's, and here are the race and ethnicity demographics of those students that received those degrees. So we were able to create over multiple years what those statistics are. X percentage of people that earned a degree above a master's degree, this was the demographics. So I won't go through all of the ins and outs of how we blended that data together and bore you with the process. I think, Dan, you need to click on, oh, there it goes. Sorry, just quite a little delay. Sorry, now I have to account for the delay. You need to go back. If you go forward. So this is that blended diversity metric. Those 5 different sources blended together into a composite availability estimate. You can see that among those, nearly 13% identify as Asian and Pacific Islander. I combine those 2 because Pacific Islander often becomes a very small number, like less than 1%. And in order to get more useful pattern information, combining them makes sense in this analysis. I am not at all ignorant to the fact that identifying as Pacific Islander is something different, and the fact that that Asian label collapses together hundreds of national origin, cultural, religious, lingual. In fact, that's true of all of these categories. But for this purpose, it is a useful analysis. Black, 6.7%, Indigenous or Native American, 0.3%, Latina or Hispanic, almost 31%, nearly 43% white, 52% female, 48% male. So that's the result of those 5 data sources. Here's what we look like across all job categories district-wide. So nearly 5,000 employees, nearly 14% Asian and Pacific Islander, 6.6% Black. You can read down. So then we compare those two numbers. You can see workforce representation on the left, availability on the right. We did this analysis, everybody in the district, and then broke it down by different job categories, and then within each college, within different job categories, and then within the district divisions within each job category. I'm not going to give you all of that data. This would just be a bunch of charts for the next 45 minutes, and everybody would be asleep. What stands out district-wide is this comparison, our diversity metric. So we have a question in the room. Let me stop there. Yes.
Yes, if you go back a slide, I'm just curious with ethnicity or race, ethnicity, it doesn't equal 100. And so what is the not 100 part representing?
Yeah, so what you don't have represented here are people that identified as multiple ethnic or racial categories. So I took out multi because there's no way to create an external estimate for that. And you don't have unknown. So the people who did not tell us, I did not include in that. So it does not equal 100%. Thank you for catching that and asking, because I glossed right over it. Any other questions in the room? I'll pause there. Any questions on Zoom? Not seeing anything. So the major thing that stands out from all employees district-wide is a pretty significant gap in the representation of people that identify as Latina or Hispanic in our workforce relative to that diversity metric. And that gap is consistent with the workforce representation relevant to our student population alone, but certainly when we layer in local communities as well. When we break that into district-wide, all managers, everybody who is in the management association, basically, regardless of whether you work at the district or one of the colleges, we see a gap between the workforce, 7.5% Asian Pacific Islander, and the diversity metric. So that becomes a focus area. For Indigenous or Native American, 0 at the time of this that identified as Indigenous or Native American, and similar to the overall statistic for Hispanic Latina, a gap. When we look at supervisors, and these are individuals that are in the SPA unit, which includes supervisory and professional administrators, Indigenous and Latina, same thing. And then also a significant difference for female. Part of the reason that exists is we have a lot more supervisors in facilities relative to the total population than we do in other areas. And that is a career industry or industry in many occupations that historically have been dominated by male representation, which will be one of the themes throughout this. We are not immune to what happens socially, and which informs why we need to think about how we do things a little bit differently, I would argue. Looking at faculty, instructional and non-instructional, full-time and part-time, you can see for Asian, Black, Indigenous, Native American, and Hispanic Latina, a significant difference. Looking at our office and technical positions, there we go. Nope, that'll be on the longitudinal analysis, sorry. Looking at our classified professionals and our confidential employees, Indigenous and Latina, Hispanic. Let me point out here, I think it happened a couple slides ago and I didn't point it out. You can see that the current workforce for Indigenous or Native American is actually higher than the diversity metric, and I put it in italics. The reason I put a yes there is twofold. One, that number is so incredibly low, I would argue it should always be a focus area. But in particular, given our land acknowledgements and the work that we've been trying to do to correct historical injustices and grow these programs, I think that always needs to be a focus area for us. So even if that was at 2%, I would still say, yeah, we have much higher representation than local demographics, but that doesn't mean it's good enough. Looking at our college police, you can see Black, Indigenous, Native American, Hispanic, Latina, and a significant gap in female, which is not unexpected given industry demographics. So that's on the representation side, current workforce compared to that diversity statistic. What that primarily tells us about is recruitment efforts. Where should we focus our time and effort? And then how should we understand and make sense of what we see in the longitudinal hiring process? And we start to look at how people actually go through this. Anywhere we have both underrepresentation in that first analysis and a disparity in the process, we know that is particularly an area of high concern. Before I go into this presentation, though, I want to give you a sense of the statistical analysis behind what I'm going to show you, because I'm not going to walk you through how standard deviations are calculated. Dan, this is the time to take the slides down, and I'll use a visual prop to help. Because we all understand something about probability fairly intuitively. You don't have to understand the math behind it. But what do we know about a deck of cards? How many are there? 52. How many of them are black? 26. How many are red? 26. How many suits are there? How many cards in each suit? 13, right? So there are some hard statistical properties to a deck of cards. So this first card, what are the odds that it's red? 50%. There's 52 cards, 26 of each color. So no surprise that it's red, right? Nobody's like, you didn't shuffle that deck. So what are the odds that the second card is red? It's a little harder to calculate. If you're thinking 50%, yes, in terms of there are only two outcomes, but there are 51 cards now, 25 red, 26 black. So the odds of the next card being black just got a little bit higher. But if you get another red card, you're not accusing me of cheating yet, right? The odds of the next card being red have diminished a little, right? Because now there are 50 cards, 24 red, 26 black. So maybe now you're like, okay, we're on a little bit of a run here. If I'm at the roulette table, I'm definitely betting black on this next one. Oh, hey, this is fine. There's nothing wrong with this deck of cards, except that what's going to happen for the next 19 cards, and at some point, if we were doing this, you would accuse me of cheating. And at some point, statistically, the probability says you're absolutely right, because the odds of what is happening right now, if I had actually shuffled this deck, are like 6 in a trillion. If you just randomly did this. So without going into all the complicated math behind that, everything that I'm about to show you that's highlighted, the odds were not good. That was just the random choice of selection, or that just everybody who happened to apply of a particular race happened to be more qualified than somebody else. It's that kind of disparity where if we were dealing cards, you'd be throwing things at me and accuse me of cheating. With that, let's go back to the slides. Get yourself a Lori, no matter where you are and what you're doing. She will make you feel incredibly good about it. It's the best thing to, thank you, Lori. That's it, yep. Okay, so we're gonna go through what actually happens in the hiring process now. And unlike the previous, which just compared percentage representation, there is a calculation of how likely is this outcome and should we be worried about that? So looking across all the hiring we did in a 4-year period, we saw this disparity, that over 12% of the applicants identified as Black, fewer than 10% were hired. And the point at which the majority of applicants that identified as Black were removed from consideration were selection for interview. So met minimum qualifications, committee of screening, and who gets selected. But that disparity that I've highlighted, where you might say, well, 12%, 10%, that's not a huge number. When you're looking at tens of thousands of applications for thousands of hiring opportunities, that disparity becomes a big number. Not unlike all those red cards I was turning over and you going, wait a minute, you stacked the deck. So statistically, when I saw the probability, I thought, this looks like an issue. What is happening in the process that might be guiding that? At this point, I can't assume what that is. I don't know why that's occurred yet. I just know that there's something going on that we should look at. We should spend our time and effort in that. So that's district-wide, every position, whether we're hiring for a classified professional or a college president or a chancellor, all squished together. So it gets more interesting when you start to break things out. There we go. So we looked at academic administrators. So these are deans, vice presidents of instruction and student services, college presidents, but people that are working on the academic side as defined in Ed Code. We see a similar outcome, a higher percentage of applicants than we saw in the overall pool, but a similar disparity. And once again, the key phase that it was happening was at selection for interview. We look at classified administrators. So all those that are not involved on the academic side, our facilities, human resources, business services type management and supervisory positions. We see a similar disparity and at the exact same point in the selection process. We look at instructional faculty. So those are in the classroom, full-time and part-time. We see a similar disparity at the same point in the process. Now, interestingly, we get to non-instructional faculty. And if you've been kind of tracking the percentages, especially in the hires column, this is a much different set of outcomes than instructional faculty, than supervisors and then managers. Right, just to jump back, I was about to say quickly, but there we go. Look how different those percentages are in the hire column compared to, now hopefully we can go back quickly to non-instructional faculty, which raises this question. Why would that look different? Does anybody have an immediate theory on why that would be? And if you've heard me do this before, you can spoil it. Let me grab a microphone. Yes.
I just want to clarify, this is library, faculty, and counselors,
Counseling,
right?
yes.
Okay. I don't have an answer for you though.
Oh, okay. You don't have a theory. Anybody have a guess? So when, oh, is there someone in the back?
Is it because more of that workforce is adjunct?
No,
No, these are
more of that
full-time.
workforce is not adjunct. Whether or not that's the reason why I can't say definitively, but I doubt that that's the explanation. So as Mona pointed out, this includes counselors and librarians. Programs like Emoja, we hire a counselor. When we go to hire a counselor for Emoja, we are very clear about what we're hiring you to do, and most importantly, who we're hiring you to serve. Which becomes interesting later because when I talk about EEO law, people often will immediately assume, well, you can't say anything about race in a job posting. I can't say that I want to hire somebody of a particular race for a particular job, but I can be explicit about who you're going to be working with. And so we could have a math instructor recruitment that said, we really want somebody that is going to improve success rates of Black students in math. There's nothing wrong with that in the law. Even in any of the executive orders or what's been talked about in the law, you can absolutely do that because I'm not assuming that the person we're going to hire is of a particular race. I'm not asking you to be the same race as the students we're talking about. I'm asking you to show me that you can make improvements in an area that's important to the performance of this job. And we do that here. So as I go around the state talking about this and people say you can't do that, so let me see your job ad for your last DSPS counselor. Did you mention disabled students when you did that? Because that sounds like an EEO violation, and they immediately get it. So I think that's instructive if my theory is true, and I don't have the data to show causality here, but if we think that that theory might be correct, it might inform how we think about every other job we post. Okay, moving on, classified professionals in our office and technical positions, and I split these out because of the general history of employment in maintenance and operations types positions. But you can see very similar pattern. In this one, we saw a significant disparity. So the probability outcomes were significant in both the selection for interview, but then also the group that got forwarded to the second level and who got a job offer coming out of that. We saw a disparity in both places. Maintenance and operations looked a little bit different. We saw it for Asian and Pacific Islander in the applicant pool and in meeting minimum qualifications, meaning we had more applicants that identified as Asian or Pacific Islander that were determined to not meet minimum qualifications for the position, which is interesting in this group because this is not a group where, like faculty or academic administrators, we have a state requirement for a master's degree. that is a pretty hard yes, no with a little bit of an equivalency process. These are a lot more subject to people's interpretation of prior experience and level of knowledge, and particularly competencies in a particular area, with some exceptions. And then we also saw a huge disparity in representation of the applicant pool for females. So as I said, we are not immune to the larger social patterns and the history of employment discrimination and segregation in America. We can see it in our own workforce. So I put recruitment there because what that ultimately tells me is we need to do a lot more work to change the culture around who does that kind of work, to put it in a more colloquial way. College police, similar issue as the others with hiring of applicants that identify as Black, though it wasn't at the interview stage. It was in that minimum qualifications. That's obviously a very different thing because there are very strict requirements for post-certified peace officer positions, becomes something of a recruitment issue. And then similar problem as in with the maintenance and operations, very low overall female representation compared to our student demographics, our employee demographics, our community demographics. So what do I see at the district-wide level? We have this persistent difference in selection for interview. The people that get out of that to the interview, there is a big barrier, especially for applicants identifying as Black. Now, when I did that across each of the colleges, the results were a little different at each place. And we saw patterns of disparities like that impacting Asian or Pacific Islander in some colleges, impacting Hispanic Latina in some areas. So it's not just one problem, but district-wide, there is a very clear pattern that you cannot ignore. At the district divisions, we had enough hiring activity in people, culture, and technology services, operations, enterprise services, and facilities, and in the educational services area to see those same kind of data. In the other areas in the district, there wasn't enough hiring activity to draw any meaningful conclusion about patterns. And so we see this persistent difference for Black and Hispanic Latina. So those outcomes all suggest to me, we ought to spend some time and energy thinking about the process and where it's creating barriers and how it aligns with our mission, who we're serving, and see if there isn't a better way to do this. So let me put some context to that before we go into discussion and more questions. So the way that we do hiring is not all that different than the way that this was kind of codified in the 1930s to 1950s. So in that era, communication and transportation became much more available, a lot faster. And the way that people could communicate a set of skills for a job to someone who had never met them, didn't know them, their family, they didn't grow up in that area. So if you grew up in Philadelphia and you've moved to New York City and you want to go apply for a job and you can't rely on any social network, how do you communicate who you are in a way that person trusts you and what you can do? The things that you do, well, let me write some kind of letter that's expressing some idea of competencies to you. Let me list a set of jobs with specific things that I did in that job to show some sense of skill sets. Let me go get some people that have some credentials that you recognize to write on my behalf. Let me get a transcript from an accredited educational institution that you can assume a certain level of knowledge, skill, ability from, which I'm really grateful for because we wouldn't exist without that, right? But all of those things were developed then and haven't changed a lot. Like, yes, if you see an application from the 1950s, it probably had whether or not they were married, whether or not they had kids, whether or not they smoked, and what religion they were at the top. All of that has gone away, but the rest of it is layered in there. And when you read a cover letter, you are learning as much about English language proficiency, the style of education that they've had, the cultural norms around how you communicate and express ideas, as you are whatever knowledge, skill, ability, or passion for the job we're purporting to communicate. Like, I can tell you a lot from a cover letter that has nothing to do with how well do you know accounting. And unfortunately, we don't necessarily engage our conscious active thinking into how is this impacting my decision-making? What are my norms that if you deviate from, I will punish you in this process for? We just do it at a mostly kind of subconscious level. Until somebody calls it out in a committee, and then I get something like, well, I scored them really low because they didn't use commas correctly, which means they didn't care enough to proofread, to which I often want to ask, like, how much money would you put on you can tell me exactly how to use a comma right now? Because I don't think anybody knows, because that rule changes and very, like, I'm an Oxford comma guy. If you know what that means, you're probably nodding with me. If you don't, you're like, what's he talking about right now? That sounds stupid. Like, but as we get into this process, we get so bogged down in these things that literally had conversations around, we should eliminate this person from any further consideration because I disagree with their grammar. We're not hiring a grammar instructor, so maybe we should widen our range of acceptability on the grammar and look for other things that are slightly more important. Or coming into an interview. I have a very clear way to dress for an interview. It is widely established in America. Most people know it. It doesn't take long to teach it. Nothing happens to me when I put this on. Like, I didn't get smarter the first time I wore a tie and was like, suddenly I understand the world in a whole new way. People received me completely different. And if I walk into an interview and I'm not wearing this, if I'm applying for anything above kind of an entry-level position, somebody in that room is going to say, well, he doesn't know how to dress for an interview, so we shouldn't hire him. Should that be the criteria? What are we replicating there? A system where cisgender, predominantly white men defined professional expectations and we all just conform. The level of confidence you express, the amount of eye contact, how loud you speak, all of these things become markers in an interview for how competent you are, for how engaging you are, for things that may not have anything to do with the job duties you're going to do, but we read positively or negatively because we've been taught that in this social setting, that's what you're supposed to do. We replicate a lot of these things that have a lot more to do with cultural norms than they do anything else. And all of these were created in an era where discrimination was legal, it was expected, it was highly encouraged. If you deviated and hired a woman for a position that the rest of society thought was man's work, you might be punished for that. So here's why I joke. Everybody knows who Jackie Robinson is, right? Anybody in the room not know who Jackie Robinson is? And the reason that you know Jackie Robinson is because he was the first Major League Baseball player in the modern era who was Black. The first non-white player of any kind in the modern era of Major League Baseball. He is appropriately famous. Less famous, appropriately, is Branch Rickey. Anybody know who Branch Rickey is? One or two hands go up. Branch Rickey was the general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers who chose to promote Jackie Robinson to the big league team. Other baseball teams would not trade or do business with the Brooklyn Dodgers after they did that. The Boston Red Sox for decades. Because he violated this rule we have. You're not supposed to do that. That's how deeply ingrained this was into society. All these standards around how you should create an application, a resume, a curriculum vitae, the cover letter, references, all of these things were basically codified in this era. And we haven't changed them very much. Maybe we've gotten rid of some of them, but the same types of information there. And the thing that I can most see from all of this, as I've said, is kind of level of education, where in the country you were educated, and what kind of cultural norms you understand are the way to represent yourself in the professional sphere. And if I wanted to, I could make a lot of fairly accurate guesses about your race, ethnicity, and gender on that. Now, I don't think many people go in and say, let me pick this up and try to discern that and then decide how I'm going to score them. But if somebody applies for a position that all of your lived experience suggests that the type of person that does that work is a particular race, ethnicity, or gender, they probably have to overcome some doubts that you're not even really engaging with. Or maybe you are consciously engaging with them. When I do this training, I'll say, some of you have met my mom, I love her, but she has some very strict gender stereotypes that she was born and raised with and the time and place that she was born and raised. And she fundamentally believes women are better caretakers than men, and men are better at cold, hard reasoning, logic, science than women. And so, yes, women can do science, but the likelihood is a man would be better at that kind of work. So anybody applying for that would have to overcome that bias. And at least she's open about it, because others are walking around this and they won't tell anybody that they're thinking this way. Also, I have to deal with the fact that for the majority of my early life, my mom was the dominant voice. I heard a lot of gender stereotypes as a 1-year-old, 2-year-old, 3. So I will replicate gender stereotypes if I'm not intentional about it, without ever thinking, just because that has been such a formative part of my life. So I have to deal with that and be able to interrupt that bias if this process with the information we get is not going to have the kind of disparities the data shows we have. So that sets some context for me for also being very interested in saying, I don't feel all that committed to anything that we've been doing. Like generally in America, in finding and hiring people, I feel no sense of attachment to any of it. The data says maybe I shouldn't be attached to it, and knowing something about this history says we ought to at least explore the idea that we could create something entirely different, and it would have better outcomes for the success of our students. So that sets the framework of why I want to put together this work group to explore this, because cultural diversity as a fundamental organizational benefit of itself is a politically difficult conversation to have right now, and is widely undervalued. Like you go out and just say diversity is good, period. There are people that want to make that illegal under this guise of reverse discrimination. EEO law does make that difficult to say. To say it would be better if we were better representative of our community right now than we are. I can't intentionally hire that way. I leave for a separate conversation whether that's good or bad. But we know that we can't just go out and do it with intent. So we have to be very clear on what's happening in the process that creates barriers. And I think that prioritizing the way we communicate and interact at an interpersonal level is one of the most important ways to get there. It's very easy and it's comfortable to assess technical competencies. I can do it just with degrees. You have a PhD, you have a master's, you're more qualified. I didn't value judge anybody. You can disagree, but you can't disagree with the reality of that difference. It's a very comfortable space to live in. But if I ask myself, who's going to best adapt the way they communicate to a diverse group of people that they're going to be communicating with, that's a lot harder to answer. And that starts to feel like a value judgment. Like I'm condemning you as a person as not being as good a person as that person type of a judgment. And that gets really uncomfortable. So maybe I just don't want to do it and I'll live in this other, what feels like more objective space. When we think about predicting job performance, how well will you perform in this role? The conversation always starts with technical skills and competencies. Can they do the key functions of accounting? Do they understand electricity well enough and how to install wiring? We don't talk nearly as much in most instances about that cultural and interpersonal piece of it. The exception, when I showed you the data on non-instructional faculty, that goes to the top of that job posting. Must be able to effectively work with students within this particular community is right at the top. We're thinking about interpersonal and cultural interactions before we even get to, and oh, by the way, you also need to have a baseline skill in counseling and an academic credential. So what I would like to do is reverse this. I would rather be focused first on who has interpersonal patterns of behavior that can allow them to effectively work with highly diverse groups of people effectively. That the sum of all of those interpersonal interactions they are having will help create the kind of culture that actually allows us to achieve our mission. And then, oh, by the way, can you do the technical parts? It's a lot easier to see, but what I found happens in this is the further we get into the process, the wider variance we're willing to accept. So we're really strict at the beginning because we still have 75 applicants and knocking out 60 feels like a good set of progress. But you get down to the last 3 and the possibility of a failed recruitment, and maybe this one won't make it to the top of the faculty hiring priorities next year and I could lose the chance to hire it, or having that vacancy, or I'm really feeling the pain of that right now. Like we got to hire somebody. I start to get a lot more tolerant of things of like, early on I would have eliminated you, but I'll accept you now. I would rather be tolerant of a wider variety of skills and technical competencies, because what I've also found is committees like to eliminate people over things that we could teach very quickly. Some of you have heard me make this joke before, but if you've ever been on a committee for an administrative assistant and you were really excited that we had that interview question, that is, the phone's ringing, there's a student coming in the front door, you promised your dean this report by 10 a.m., how are you going to handle it? This is a great question, right? It's a real thing that's going to happen. So my very first committee at Shasta College was for an administrative assistant position. And when we were deciding on interview questions, someone mentioned we got to do the scenario question. And I'm new, so what's the scenario question? So they laid that out. And it was like, conversation's over. Of course, we would never do this without it. So just out of curiosity, because I'm new here, what's the right answer? Turns out 6 committee members had 4 answers on what the right way to do that was. Like, so 1, if we as a group don't know the right answer, this might be bad. 2, let's say I don't know the right way and you're right of the 4. How long would it take you to teach me that? 30 seconds, 90 seconds, maybe 5 minutes? Like, do we want to make a career decision on something that you can teach in that short amount of time? I would rather be worried about, I can't teach you how to be more receptive to people who don't share your cultural worldview, because I know I really probably can't teach you that. But I can teach you how to use PeopleSoft. Maybe not, no one actually knows how to use it, but let's pretend. But we really want to ask ourselves, is this the kind of skill or technical competency that it would take too long to teach? Or at this level, we can't tolerate that. You have to come in on day one being an expert in this. I would rather hire for a much stricter set of criteria around interpersonal and cultural competencies, and then get a little broader with, you know what, they don't have that, but we could teach them in 4 months. You're gonna work here for 20 years. No one's gonna remember the 4 months it took to master that one thing. So EEO law restrictions, as I have said a couple times now, it is illegal to say, I would prefer to hire somebody based on their race, ethnicity, gender identity, any other protected status. So that's responding to prior to 1964 in the Civil Rights Act, an era where it was perfectly legal to say that. So EEO law just said you can't close the door on access. EEO law does not at all care about outcomes. And that's the problem with getting rid of disparate impact theory of discrimination, is it's entirely focused on outcomes. It is perfectly legal to be very clear about the environment you're going to be working in and the success that we're prioritizing. So we can have a job ad that says you have to be able to demonstrate that you can successfully teach whatever to these demographics of students. We could tie it to equity gaps and outcomes. We can say it much more broadly, but we really need to elevate that, I think, across the board. We're hiring you to work in a highly diverse environment. That's a skill set in and of its own, and it is essential. It's nice if you have it, but we can kind of minimize your interactions with others if you don't get along. We all have to interact with people. I have also found that when I go out and speak in conventional HR terms, people immediately say, oh yeah, I know what that is, and then they stop listening. So if this said recruitment at the top, you would go, oh yeah, I know what that is, I'm gonna stop listening. But when I say invite, you say, what are you talking about? And so I wanna think about that though also in terms of, I don't wanna recruit people in to the military. I want to invite them to come be part of a mission. I want people who immediately feel that sense of, that's the environment I've been looking for my whole career, finally. I don't want to convince people, hey, you seem really skilled, please come work here. Like, I want you to want to be part of what we're doing. So if we think in that terms, changes the way that we would post a vacancy announcement, communicate the fact that we are looking to hire someone. Initiate, I've had some interesting feedback on that term. That's where you would see onboarding and orientation. I don't want to just onboard you or orient you within the space. I want to have you become part of a culture, which is I'm trying to say there, not initiate in whatever negative thing might go that, but initiate you into a culture so that you understand that while my responsibility is this, I am part of this huge educational mission with 4,999 other people all moving towards the same outcomes. Want to include people. And so this is where we would talk about participation. But I want as many possible voices informing how well we're doing what we're doing as possible. Like, I don't want people feeling like, well, my job is just whatever, therefore my opinion on this doesn't matter. Your opinion probably matters more than mine does with my job title, because you're much closer to that work. Like, I'm distanced from so much of what's happening around the district. My opinion about what's happening in admissions and records offices means nothing. I'm not there. I really don't even know. Yours does though. So we need to create meaningful inclusion in as many different spaces so that people know this is the kind of place where I can walk in and say, from my perspective, this is working well, this isn't working well, and that's heard and valued. We need to invest. That would be professional development. I want us to think of it as we as a district need to be investing in everybody who works here to do the best possible work and in their career growth. Changes the way we think about it. It's not a deficit thing at all. It's completely value added. And then we need to inquire. We need to ask how we're doing. We need to ask how you're experiencing this. So changing the way that we do climate surveys, changing the way that applicants get to give us feedback on the process, which generally happens this way. Something really bad happened and I figured out who to email and then fired it off as many different places. Like, there's no formal inquiry into how'd this process work for you? What feedback might you provide? We have thousands of people a year experiencing this process that all could provide some really interesting feedback if we ask for it. As we think about inviting people, as I said, our mission, vision, values should be evident all over the place. People should know who we are and what we're about and what culture they're coming to work part of, and not think, yeah, but I'm over in this area and that's not really me. That's more like in the sociology division. We have to convince people that we mean it when we say we value them, that you can be here. I've said this in a number of forums that the way I'm talking might not be the way you're experiencing things right now. And I get that. It's an aspirational thing. I need everybody helping us to create. So that should be clear in the job ads. It should be clear in what we're asking people throughout this process. And committees should be thinking about, how am I getting information about how this person's going to be part of this culture? Just very briefly, we have made some progress in employment marketing. Our website has changed. There's a lot more information. This is a still image of one of the early design concepts, but I couldn't grab a screenshot of the current one. But go check out the current one if you haven't. It looks a lot different than it did before. And it's communicating a lot more about our mission and who we aspire to be, who we serve, and then giving people insights into different jobs with these short videos that David Brooks has put together that are really great. You want to see what a day in the life of our librarians looks like, what our, landscape groundskeepers look like. It's our employees telling you. They're passionate about working here, the impact of the work they're doing. I love watching those videos. We need to do more of that. When it comes to how people express interest, apply for jobs using the conventional language, I think we need to get a lot more clear about the ability to serve diverse communities successfully is just as important as whatever baseline technical competencies we need. We need to understand what information is informing bias in the process. And then anonymous screening is producing some interesting results. So I didn't have time to put it together in the presentation. I'll be doing that in the fall. But Miramar has been piloting this for a year. So we have January 1, 2024 to December 31, 2024. The applicant pools are different. The pools going forward to interview look different. I was able to compare them. Can't draw too wild of a conclusion yet because we have 4 years of data on the one hand and just 1 year on the other. And there are a number of reasons you might see variances, but I find it kind of compelling. Also, the living wage is changing things. So I went and looked at custodial pools, admin assistant 1, admin assistant 3, student services assistant, some of the positions that had the biggest impact. The applicant pools are like double what they've been on average over any time over the past 4 years. So we're doing some interesting things that are already having some positive changes. How do we scale that? How do we build on that? The questions. I'm going to jump ahead to the end. So what I would like to accomplish, I want to create a district-wide work group starting in the fall and ask people to address this. If you didn't have to be tied to anything we're currently doing, how would we invite people to join our mission? How would we ask people to express that interest? And I put in the parentheses what the conventional language around that. So when I say expression of interest, applying for the job. But don't think about an application as the standard thing we've always thought of. What information would you want from people? How would you want to receive it? There's so many new tools to do that. We don't have to be tied to any one thing anymore. How would we identify people that are capable of contributing to our mission within this role? Thinking comprehensively about from screening through to hiring. Build off of the recommendations of that work group. My goal is to be able to actually revise all of our policies and procedures around employment and hiring, implement those procedures, measures the outcome, and make this a continual learning loop. That as we see the data that comes out of those, we continue to tweak them. But I don't want to be tied to, well, we have to continue doing this one thing. Like, yeah, if law requires it, fine. But I'd rather design something that we think would be really successful within our context and then make it legally compliant. Because if we start with the constraints, it will limit our ability to dream. We'll immediately start killing any good idea, is my experience. So with that, I've left about 30 minutes for discussion, questions, answers. Anyone on Zoom first have a question, a comment, thought you'd like to share? Not,
Amanda's taking the call, so.
yeah, not hearing Amanda jump in. So open
At
it up
this
on
point,
Zoom
no
or in
one
the.
has raised their hand, so.
Thank you, Amanda. I saw Andrea's hand start to go up. Carla's coming up behind, or Joy. It's a race. Let's see who's going to get there. Carla's in the lead.
I just want to say that my cheeks hurt because I'm smiling big time. I'm super excited for this.
I'm really glad to hear this. For those of you who don't know, Andrea is our employment supervisor, and what I've described will be a ton of work for her. And so the fact that you're really happy about that work makes me really happy.
I'm very passionate about this though. So it's something that is, I am going to volunteer to be part of this work group. But I'm excited to see and work with the work group and, come up with some ideas to improve the outcomes.
Yes, excellent. And I should also add here, so the Chancellor's office succeeded after years of efforts of getting ongoing EEO funding in our budget. And they do an allocation, each district gets some EEO funds, but they've used some of the additional funds the last couple of years for what they call EEO best practices grants. And that opportunity to apply just came out. So this is all very timely because we will actually have an opportunity to get additional funding that can fund some of the work or the technologies or whatever comes out of that. So Betty had asked me about applying for that. I'm giving you what my input into that process will be. But yeah, so it's more than just creating the opportunity in the district. There's an opportunity to fund some things as well, which is excellent. Mona.
So a couple of things. First, just a confirmation of what it sounds like to me is that you're saying, because typically we lead with the skills, and you're saying lead with what traditionally we've called good fit, but we're redefining good fit as, cultural competency and interpersonal skills, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I did a teacher thing. But the other thing is I'm thinking like more specifically about faculty and, we run into the problem of, minimum quals, which is not a problem. I mean, it's important, but also how do we, are there going to be efforts? And you said funding so that, I hope that this will be applicable to this case. Will there be funds towards doing things like recruiting people and moving people from areas because we might not have the people we need with the degrees we need? Will there be funds dedicated in the future? So if we dream big, is there going to be an opportunity to fund some of those big dreams? Number one. And number two is, will there be opportunities to pay faculty to do some of this work? And I'm speaking specifically from faculty perspective. Of course, we'd want to pay everyone. But we're going to send the call out for this work group, and people are going to be interested. But I know that there is a need to have diverse voices, and unfortunately, those diverse voices are doing a lot of work on campus, and they're spread super thin. And there's going to be concerns about adding something else to their plate, doing this important work, but also like, are we going to be able to compensate them?
Yeah. So on the, sorry, I got caught up thinking about the second part. What was the first point?
The first one is will there be funding potentially in the future to
implement some of this? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I will exhaust myself figuring out how to fund that. This is really important to me. So I will do everything I can to figure out how to make that happen. The second one, I don't see why we couldn't, if we're asking somebody to do something outside of their job assignment. So I'll just say I'm committed to figuring that out, and we probably need to have a longer conversation of the specifics of what that looks like.
Mhm. Thank you.
Yeah.
We have a question from Cynthia Giamarinero.
Thank you,
She
Amanda.
should now be able to unmute herself.
Thank you. Excuse me. I was wondering, is there a timeline for this work group? Is it a 1-year project, a multi-year project?
So my ask will be get this done within the 25-26 academic year, with the caveat that if the work needs more time, we'll give it more time. But I do want to have a sense of urgency to it, that this isn't just, well, we only met twice, sorry. But if it needs more time, it needs more time. But I would love it if we have a set of recommendations by spring 2026.
Yeah.
Yes, Natalia.
Yeah, gracias. So my question is related to you spoke for a little minute about, if you will, the biases or how in certain ways people decide because of the way that someone is dressed or the accent or whatever. So my question is, we will need probably to think about training and support us understanding those biases. So within this work plan, do you envision a set of, because we have about, I don't know, 5,000 total employees. So the training for us to be doing this work and really have the support while we still continue hiring, you know what I mean? So how do we prepare for the transition? And the second part of my question is, if we were to hear executive orders that impede some of the things you're dreaming and engaging to do, how will you go about that?
So on the first one, yeah, there's one, I do think it's time to go back and revisit our training. It's worked well for us, but everything needs to be revisited. And in the context of thinking very differently about the process, it's going to require us to think differently about the training. Also, we have not, for some reasons, been able to fully implement the employee experience and engagement effort within people, culture, and technology services. But what I imagine in the future is part of that initial, what we call onboarding now process, we'll have every new hire go through that. Everybody will have had it at the start. And then, periodically, or as people are participating in committees, they'll go through it again. But we'll just create it as a baseline, like part of your introduction to the district is going through that, which I think will also be helpful just more broadly, because biases aren't only a problem when we're evaluating applications or interviews, right? So doing that in a much bigger way than just thinking about this one process, I think is important. It's just a matter of time. On the second part, we will evolve as the law requires us to, but I will be as creative in us doing what we know is the right thing, and then making it as legally compliant as it needs to be in whatever's happening in a larger context. But I never, so here's my HR days, the way I said this. Too many HR offices are so worried about legal compliance, they create processes that are horrible to experience and not all that effective. But they are really legally compliant. I'd much rather create a process that is highly effective that we happen to make sure was legally compliant. So that's the thinking on that. I would just continue thinking that way.
Good.
Ricky has a question. He should be allowed to able to unmute
go.
himself.
We'll go Ricky and then we'll go into the room.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. And I want to build on Mona's question to just unpack it a little bit more as we do this great work that I commend you for unpacking this. Is the reality, and you and I have had this talk, and you've talked openly about your move from Shasta County to San Diego and the cost of living and the likelihood of being able to purchase a home. And I think that builds on Mona's point that we could do this work, and there are people who are coming from communities that are much more affordable to live in, to San Diego, where it might be $2 million for a 1,200 square foot fixer. That we have this notion of fairness of how somebody is placed on the salary schedule when people coming from certain communities may be at a great disadvantage. I've shared the story of one of my faculty members who's having a challenge transitioning in their first year, just with the cost of living. Could you clarify when you talked about committing resources, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mona, that spoke to the first point you were making in your question?
Yeah, so I definitely wasn't hearing the question in that particular context. But this is one of those areas I'm going to be legally compliant and less effective with the answer. I welcome the opportunity to engage with our collective bargaining partners in that conversation. I know that pain firsthand, but it's not something that the district can just say, okay, we're going to do this and unilaterally impose that. But it's an ongoing conversation that I'm definitely interested in us having.
Yeah, and I had a second question, if I could, just really quickly. Have you done a deep dive on similar on our adjunct hiring? Because I would be very interested in similar demographics for adjuncts, which we know is primarily the pathway to being a full-time faculty member.
I have, but I don't trust the applicant data for applicant pools nearly as much as I do the others. There's a lot to go into there, but basically I don't think that we have as strict a process around a group of people expressing interest in a position and then a process you can break down into stages and then say, here was who was considered and then who was hired. So I don't think that we're administering that in a way right now that facilitates a robust data analysis to come in and say, the best we can say right now is here's who works here compared to that diversity metric. And it doesn't look all that different than our contract faculty. Slightly different, but not a huge difference. But that's an area that needs to be addressed by this work group. How do we do adjunct hiring? And you could say all of that, even worse about NANCE hiring. There really is no such thing as an applicant pool and any kind of analysis. So
Thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor Smith. First thing in with the work group, I do hope that the different bargaining units and that are able to be at that table. So that's just kind of a first request I'm assuming would happen, but
yes.
want to voice it out loud. And then in my interest, you said like selection and interview. I'm curious if in the future, if the analysis was done, but to me, I see the screening of interviews to be, or screening of applications for interview. Then what happens from those that get interviewed at the first round to the second. And then from the second to sometimes there is a third interview and then the hiring. And I'm just wondering if when you're seeing that disparity, is it at the selection process? So just being selected to interview or what's that? Or is that, and the other ones you haven't seen the funnel or impact happening? I'm just kind of curious of across that because I see kind of 2 or 3 steps that happen in the hiring.
Yeah, so first, a data collection issue that we need to fix. Cannot tell in the data the difference between the first interview and the second interview. I know who got an interview. I don't know which one it was. So I had to collapse those into one. And we did have more isolated areas where the interview was the source of the disparity. But what you saw in everyone I showed district-wide, it wasn't the interview where we had a statistically significant disparity. It was in who got selected to go. And that we know is first level, right? Because I couldn't tell who got selected for the second interview, so to speak. But yeah, there were there were fewer instances of a barrier between either the first or second interview and the job offer.
Do we survey applicants, particularly those who maybe are offered positions but don't ultimately take the position? And then what happens to that data? And is that something that could be looked at district-wide so we can better understand sort of why people might not be deciding to plant their career here?
Andre, I feel very confident saying we do not survey at all, right? Okay, good. I didn't think we did. So no, we are not surveying. So the only ones that we know are the people that tell us, like, well, the salary's too low, or I've reconsidered and I looked at the home market and I can't afford to move there or don't want to do that. But no, we haven't collected that information in any organized way. And we only know by the few exceptions that express it. So that was that inquire bullet point of we're not asking. We could learn a lot if we started asking, right? Yeah. Other questions? Comments, brilliant ideas? Yes, Mark.
Just looks like posed this observation earlier. I'm interested in how you also hope to shine light on what may be omitted. So like, for example, Hawaii, thinking about we're seeing applicants not respond their ethnicity. Like, what does that talk about? The idea, like, how do we bring that to light a little bit more? We are not giving the state any information of individuals that receive accommodations as an employee. Like, how can sometimes the absence of data, where do you feel that as also priorities of bringing that to the table or bringing that as a insight to how to impact the culture at our district?
Yeah, so I read the lack of response, the unknowns in the data as first and foremost a communication problem. We've not clearly articulated why we're asking you that. And I often say in this type of presentation, given the history of America, if you're asking me my race, it's perfectly reasonable to assume you're going to change how you treat me based on how I answer. So maybe I don't want to answer that for you. That's a totally logical assumption to make. So if we're not clear on why we're asking, then I assume some portion of people saw that question and said, I don't want to ask. Now, I have seen, because I work with a number of districts with their data, I have seen a slight uptick as this has become more politicized. And I do think that there is a certain group of people that like to just be somewhat defiant about I'm not going to tell you and make a political statement in not telling you. I would assume on a longitudinal scale of more than 10 years, that'll just be a minor blip. I do think also, though, this can be a process failure. So I've seen some application systems where that question comes at the very end and people are tired and they just want to get through it now. And if it's something you can skip, you can just skip it. Some who you're not required to check anything. So you don't have to check a button or a box that says, I do not want to tell you. You can just leave it blank and skip through. And so there's some things you can do structurally that will increase the likelihood of somebody answering. And I think that we do a fairly decent job of it relative to others, other than I don't think we're doing as good a job as we could about communicating. Why are we asking you this question? What do we intend to do with this information? Why does it matter to us? To encourage people to say, I really want to give that to you now that I understand what you're doing with it. I will say our response rate is pretty good. Like, I didn't see our unknown rate and go, oh, wow, we have a big issue. I've seen some districts, it's more than 50%, which suggests all sorts of problems. Like, there are probably multiple things that I just outlined that are going wrong there that need to be fixed. So overall, I feel pretty good about it. But I do think we should, whether we need to or not, be much more clear about why we want to know that. Yeah, Poppy.
Thanks, Chancellor. I have two thoughts. The first is that it would be wonderful to, your point, to communicate to prospective employees that we, as a workplace, have a commitment to ensuring an accessible workplace for folks who have disabilities. And I think that's a good way to encourage disclosure of disability. So thank you for making that point. The second more broad comment that I have is that whenever I talk to folks who are interested in working for the district, friends, colleagues, old colleagues, people inevitably say to me, well, the application process is long and cumbersome. The interview process was horrible. Nobody even smiled at me. And then it's just a black box until I don't know what. And I think all of us are committed or ought to be committed to getting the best colleagues that we possibly can because it makes our work easier. So I'm really excited to see changes to that process across the spectrum so that I can feel good about saying to somebody that I know is well qualified, not having to apologize for hanging in through that process until you get to the workplace, because the people are really nice once you're here. So I know I'm saying maybe the most obvious thing ever, but it in very practical terms, that's what it looks like. Am I willing to talk to people that I know who are qualified to come and work with us? And it's very hard to do that when I know the process is so painful. So thank you.
Yeah, without prepping them for it. Now you're going to walk into this room and people are going to look like they hate you. Trust me, it's not them, it's the rules. So here's my joke on that. I feel like there was some landmark EEO case against a community college in our system in 1985. And the HR director, vice chancellor, associate vice president, whatever at that time, wrote down a list of rules that everybody adopted, but then they forgot where those were, so they became the unwritten rules. Because literally every district does this. Like, you're not supposed to give any type of nonverbal reaction whatsoever. And it's all based on this EEO fear. Like, if I smile somehow, it's gonna be an EEO violation. Well, like, don't just smile at people who are one race and you'll be fine. Like, please humanize this process. So yeah, that no matter what, that's coming out of this. Like, we're going to change those rules. We're going to inject humanity into it. So thank you for shining a light on it again. And I will say that when I did this in the fall, some of those comments came up. And I have been trying ever since then to be able to join one of the supervisor manager monthly calls and do here are the new rules of hiring committees. I have literally not been able to deconflict one of them yet. So part of it's been my failure to manage my schedule better, but I really want to implement that right now. So everybody watching, push back in your next committee. The chancellor said we could smile. Yes, I did. It's going to be recorded and posted.
Richard Weinroth has a question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, let's go in the room one, and then we'll hop over to Zoom and then come back to the room.
Thanks for the presentation, Chancellor Smith. New to the district, still learning the ropes. You mentioned that you want district employees to see themselves as part of this 5,000 person workforce, all working towards the same outcomes. What are those outcomes?
The success of every one of our students in a environment where each one of them feels like every single interaction they have has affirmed them, their lived identities, that they belong here, and that we're invested in their success. And so it feels like going into a really high-end restaurant where they're super excited you came here and they do as much as possible to make that fit you and whatever you need as best you can. Instead of McDonald's where it's stand in line, give us your order, hit your button, like really have people experience that in every single interaction.
Got it. And how are we measuring that success?
So I would like to measure it by looking at what percentage of people in our area are earning a living wage, looking at health outcomes, looking at crime statistics. Like I want to see community improvement across the board, and that being how we measure our success. Yes, there are metrics in between there, our graduation rates, transfer rates, how many students go on and get a job in their field of study. But I feel like if we do our work really well, we can see less poverty in San Diego. We can have less crime in San Diego. We can have longer lives in San Diego.
Yeah, totally agree. Thanks.
I had a comment and idea. I feel like we compartmentalize our departments, and I feel like we should encourage blue collar work like facilities, that not only are they just hands-on work, but whenever they see a student, staff, faculty, they should interact with them. Like I know on a personal experience, ECC, where I work at, it's more smaller, so it's a lot easier for me to do it, but I interact with the students maybe 20, 25 times a day, just seeing what they do, what they're interested in, and feeling like they belong. And I feel like that should be more encouraged through facilities, and so that they don't feel like they're only just in the background.
Yeah, I love that. Totally agree with you. Welcome any ideas on how to make that happen. Because, well, they're different topic of conversation we can go into, but there's a lot of research around which students interact with which employees in colleges and find that sense of belonging. And facilities is a really important part of that for some students. So anyways, different conversation, different time. But yeah, let's work on that. Okay, sorry, we were going to go to Zoom, I think.
Richard Weinroth should now be able to unmute himself.
Okay, thank you, Chancellor, for this presentation. And I apologize, I had a meeting, so I missed part. My questions are two, and if you have already answered it, you'll say you have. The first one is this, the equivalency process. What happens is when a screening committee gets an applicant who doesn't meet the minimum quals but could do an equivalency, it's too late. At that point, we cannot have the leisure of saying, you know what, do an equivalency and then we can talk to you. Instead, what we do is we remove them from the pool. We're losing people, especially our CTE programs where we know we need equivalencies. So my question is, can we front load this where someone is going to look at them early? Now, there's two people who could do this. One could be the committee chair, and then they need to get paid for this extra load, or it's going to be HR. But we're losing the opportunity because we're not providing the people hey, you would look really good, but we need an equivalency application. And that's what I'm asking. How can we bring that into the process?
Yeah, so Richard, I love the idea of front loading it. I respect that the Senates have priority in developing ideas around what we do with equivalency. And so I don't want to overstep and suggest what the Senate should be thinking about. But let me say this, I am happy to engage with you on how we make that process a lot easier to navigate, a lot more functional for us in the work that we need to do, and much, much more effective for the applicants, because I agree with everything that you said, and the process isn't working all that well right now. So let's get together and fix it.
Thank you, Chancellor, because when we reviewed the process, it felt like we're doing everything after that point, not doing that. So thank you. My second question, if I may, Chancellor, is this. The EEO reps in the room serve a very important function, but I think they're understated in how much they can do. I think we have to figure out how to do a special training that says to an EO rep, how can you come into the room knowing that you don't want to interrupt the candidate, but there are going to be some times when things are not right. And it's really scary for an EO rep, especially an EO rep who is like an instructional assistant, who is now invited to be in this important role, but there's a dean who's at the top of the table.
Yeah, there's a lot of social dynamics that go into serving on a committee that influence the individual behaviors that make it more or less effective. And that's an important one. So similarly, would love to get into with this work group, how do we make sure that we have a process that's working and the ability to have accountability in that process? I'm avoiding using the specific term because I don't want to tie us to it has to be called an EEO rep or it has to be done the way that we've done it. But let's get together and figure out how to make that work given those dynamics. If there's a way I think that we can do that. We need to find it so that somebody who is, regardless of their role, empowered to intercede in that process if something's going wrong and it's not role power starts to kick in or I'm going to have consequences outside of the space for doing so. Like we have to end that.
Thank you, Chancellor.
We have one other person who wants to speak. Lorenz, you should now be able to unmute yourself.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chancellor Smith, for allowing us to engage in this important work. My question is, have you decided on how the committee or group will be formed and or who will be leading that charge?
I know some definites about who will be involved. I've not decided I'm going to unilaterally say this is what the representation must be. So I'll be talking with cabinet about this. I'll be talking with DGC about it, getting a lot of input to make the final decisions. But at a bare minimum, all of our collective bargaining and meet and confer groups, our academic senates, classified senates, all of our participatory governance process stakeholders in it. Certainly people in culture need to be part of that. Andrea volunteered because that's good because she was going to get voluntold as employment supervisor. This is completely relevant. So there's some people by their role need to be in that room, but I look forward to getting a lot more input on how widely we need to cast that net, what perspectives need to be represented in that, and then how we make it also functional. Because very quickly, I've just named off a 50-person work group that can never actually schedule time to meet. So we need to work through all those logistics.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you, Lorenz.
So just a suggestion, if you could consider to perhaps do a little form to gather feedback. You don't have everyone here, and this is a very process. I believe if you receive some feedback before this work group is formed, you can have a lot of insights of how that work or what impressions people have about it. Maybe privately they can share concerns. I know it's probably a lot of data for you and your office, so my boss is not present, and I know this is an HR matter and we couldn't be involved, but in whatever manner, even just doing the form or whatever we can support, just let us know.
I appreciate the recommendation and the offer. I mean, at this point, we'd be asking for ideas around this. So I don't think it would need to be confidential in that way. Like it wouldn't like send that out and tell everybody, so this is what so-and-so thinks. But having somebody from the research department be part of that, I think would be fine. And I would welcome it. So thank you for the offer. And I'll make sure Michelle knows that it's okay you volunteered. Anyone else? We've got like 2 minutes remaining, or we can finish early. Okay, so this will be posted online so that anybody can go back and watch it at any time. As I said, when the call goes out and more details around the work group, I expect there will be some interest in what was said in that presentation. Also, if you're interested in going back and watching it, it'll be available. really look forward to seeing what comes out of this process. This is very exciting work. Thank you all for coming, engaging the questions. Appreciate you. Have a good rest of your week.